Well, good afternoon, everybody. I think we should get started. We're still having people sign in, but let's get things rolling so we can try to keep ourselves on time. I'm Chet Kerr, I'm a member of the board, but I wanted to personally welcome everybody to our next session in our presentation by Dr. Neil Maher today. But I'm going to introduce Veronica Gedrich, who is going to formally welcome you all to this today's talk. Go ahead. Veronica, you have to unmute yourself.
Okay. So thanks for coming today, everyone, and thanks for joining us for our fourth online program. Just a few quick notes before the program begins. First, let me remind you about our ongoing project, Portrait of a Village in the Time of Crisis. We may be entering a new phase of the COVID pandemic now that fall has begun, and we would love to read about what's happening in your lives now. Please send us your reflections, stories, and photos. Just follow the instructions on the Irvington Historical Society website to submit them. Also, let me mention our October 18th celebration honoring this year's legacies, the 11 men and women who shared their memories of life in Irvington in the mid-20th century. I hope you will join us then to hear their heartwarming stories. If you haven't purchased a ticket to this event yet, you can still do so by registering on our website, www.irvingtonhistoricalsociety.org. And once you register and provide your email address, you will be sent a link to our presentation. This event is in lieu of a live fundraiser, and we count on your generosity to be able to continue all of our programs, including the Legacy Project and the one you'll be sharing with us today. Our speaker today is Neil Maher, an Irvington resident and a member of the Irvington Historical Society Board. Neil is a professor of history and master teacher in the Federated History Department at the New Jersey Institute of Technology and Rutgers University, Newark. He's an award-winning author, instructor, and public speaker interested in the environmental and political history of the United States. His offerings include courses in environmental history, urban history, and political history, and seminars on the Great Depression, the immediate post-World War II period, and the 1960s to 1980s era. More recently, he has developed an environmental justice website for research seminars that he teaches on the undergraduate and graduate levels. For such efforts, he has received the two most prestigious teaching awards at his university. His most recent books include Apollo in the Age of Aquarius and Nature's New Deal, the Civilian Conservation Corps, and the Roots of the American Environmental Movement, which I believe is the basis for Neil's talk for us today. Neil, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us.
Neil, you have to unmute yourself.
Starting off with on the right note. Sorry about that. Chet, thank you. Veronica, thank you so much for that introduction. Can everyone hear me? Just give me a thumbs up if you can. Thank you very much. I want to thank the Irvington Historical Society for inviting me to talk, especially Veronica Gedrich, and also Pat Ryan, the former president who got me involved in this amazing organization many, many years ago. And I especially want to thank Chet Kerr, not only for organizing this panel and helping me with the Zoom as well, but also for promoting the talk. It's rare to get 180 people registered. I don't know how many are out there, but that's an incredible turnout. So thank you, Chet. And I had known about Chet's skills as a civil rights attorney and also a lot of the good work he's done with the Land Trust, but I didn't know he was a triple threat until I listened to his amazing talks over the last couple months about Irvington's history. And it's really, really, really good history. And Chet, I just want to say keep up the great work and thank you very much for teaching all of us about Irvington. I want to thank all of you also out there for tuning in. I've given talks all over the country and abroad, and never have I had so many people come to a talk. So it's very, very exciting. Before I begin, I want to ask a favor. And I know it's going to be a little bit difficult when we're talking online like this, but I want to ask you all to interrupt me, if possible, through the chat, not through your mute buttons. Stay muted, but if you could all open up your chat, I would be really appreciative, because what I find for me as I speak in these sorts of situations is that if I can get interrupted, or if people can ask questions during my talks, for me, it creates a more of a dialogue for me, and it puts me in a different place and helps me communicate the material a little bit differently. So if everyone can open up their chat and keep it open and pop in some questions if you have them as I go, it would really be helpful. I've also built in a couple of spots in the talk where I'm going to ask you questions, and just type in single words so I can get some feedback, just so we can make this as much of a dialogue as possible. I know it's so hard, and my students have the same issues when we teach online, but I hope that we can have a bit of a dialogue. I want to begin with an opening exercise. I'm going to share my screen first of all, so we can see. All right. Thumbs up if we're all good. Okay, great. We're going to begin with a bit of an opening exercise. So imagine you purchase an old house. Maybe it's in Irvington. That's what I did when I moved back 7 years ago. I purchased a house built in 1879. And let's imagine you go up in your attic and you find an old box of papers from the 1930s. And my clicker is not working. Chet, I'm not able to forward my, let's see here. Okay, I'll do it that way. And we find in that box a paper, this cartoon here. All we know about it is that it's from the 30s. We know nothing else. What I want to do is I want to just sort of think about this cartoon. And if you can just type in some ideas about it, any immediate thoughts that come to mind, what's this about? What's going on here? And we're going to return to this cartoon later at the very end of our talk and see if we understand it at all differently. So just take your time, take a minute and type in some words. It's a before and after panel. We have two parents, there we go. So opportunity, maybe this young man is getting some opportunity. Physical, emotional, intellectual growth, good. It's like going off to college, learning to work, experience, good. It's about sending your boy into the CCC, like going into the Marines to grow up and become a man, good. This is great. The CCC, great, great, great. So the idea here is that there's a change going on, right? We see young Wilbur who wants to join the CCC in the before section on the top. And then in the bottom, he comes back a year later and he's transformed and his parents are in shock. And what I want to do is I want to go through the history of the CCC and the history of the Great Depression and return to this cartoon at the end and see if we can look at this cartoon, look at actual parts of it for evidence and a little deeper thinking about this cartoon and what it means. So we'll return to Wilbur in a little while after we've learned a little bit more about two types of stories around the Great Depression era and the Hudson Valley. One of these stories will be a more general story about the Great Depression and the New Deal. That's very much a national story. And then the second story will be about the Hudson Valley and a specific New Deal program, the Civilian Conservation Corps. And that's very much a local story. And I'm also going to try to include some new research, some information I found very recently about the CCC in Irvington which will be nice. And then we'll return to the cartoon and see if we see some new things in it that we might not have seen just now. And then finally, I want to end with Q&A, and it's an important part of this experience for me. I want to use the Q&A not only to talk about the history that we'll be discussing today, but also how that history might be applied to some of the problems that we're facing today. Right now, we have almost 10% unemployment, not as high as the 1930s, but it's an issue. And we also have an environmental crisis going on as well, the crisis of climate change. So maybe we could talk in the Q&A not only about the history, but perhaps about how the proposals, the Green New Deal proposals might be important or possible. And also there was just a bill introduced to create a new and improved CCC. So we could talk about that as well. All right. My goal is to talk for about 45, 50 minutes and then leave a lot of time for Q&A. All right. Thumbs up. Thank you. All right. Good. So when we are in high school and we are taught about the Great Depression, we read textbooks. And the textbooks almost always portray the Great Depression in pretty stark terms. It begins on October 29th, 1929, known as Black Tuesday. That's the day the New York stock market crashed. $30 billion lost in an instant on that day. And it continues, this economic crisis continues throughout the 1930s. 5,500 banks shut their doors. Here we see the American Union Bank in New York. There's a bank run, people trying to get their money out before the bank goes under. 25% unemployment, 1 in 4 working age Americans unable to find a job. And because of that, images like this are very common, but also images like this. This is a bread line in New York City. You can see the L train over on the upper right corner. These people were just lining up to get a loaf of bread to get through the week. So in those textbooks, we also learn about Franklin Roosevelt's response, the New Deal. And if you remember, we were sort of pushed and forced to memorize all those alphabet agencies, right? That were very, very confusing. We had the Works Progress Administration, which put unemployed Americans to work building public roads. Here we see actually an integrated crew, which is quite rare, outside Pittsburgh in 1934. And the WPA was not to be confused with the PWA, which hired unemployed Americans to build public buildings like schools, libraries, and this post office in Eugene, Oregon. I'm just gonna change my thing over here. And then there were also a host of arts programs as well. I'm sorry, we had the Federal Theater Project, which put unemployed actors and directors to work putting on performances in public spaces. You had the Federal Writers Project, which put unemployed writers and editors to work creating literature in the public good. This was one of 50 guides for states throughout the country that were produced during this time. And then also the Federal Artists Project that put sculptors, painters, and other sorts of artists to work creating art in public spaces. This is a mural in Thayer County, Nebraska, in the post office. So what we learn in those textbooks is that the Great Depression was an economic emergency, and the New Deal was Franklin Roosevelt's political response. And what I want to do today is try to get us beyond that a little bit, to think a little bit more than just an economic emergency and a political response. There's more to the story here that I think we need to think about. And to begin to think about it, I want to go back into the attic of that old house where we found that cartoon, that document. And let's imagine that there's a film clip in that same box, a film clip from the New Deal. I want us to now look at a film clip. It's about 1.5 minutes long. And when we're looking at it, I want us to think about what might be in this film clip that we weren't told about or we didn't really learn about. what might be in the film clip that's missing from those textbooks. Okay, so let's try to do that now.
In 1933, the chief concern of the American government was to break the back of a bad depression. Among the conditions to be remedied were two President Roosevelt recognized at once. Employment for hundreds of thousands of young men and war veterans was imperative. Havoc wrought by soil erosion had long since shown the necessity of the immediate restoration, conservation, and further development of the country's natural resources. As one solution for both problems, the organization and work of the Civilian Conservation Corps was undertaken. And in 2 years, through this unique plan, both problems were well on their way toward solution as great aids to economic recovery. The saving of natural resources was conservation pure and simple. One important phase of the development of these resources was more than that. It was the making of a nationwide system of recreational areas, smaller, more numerous state parks, closer to the people, more easily accessible for their use, supplementing the magnificent national parks.
So, what was in that film that is often not in those textbooks that we read in high school? If you can just use your chat and just write in single words, it would be helpful. No women. That's fantastic, and we're going to see that as a recurring theme throughout the New Deal. Is there anything that was in the film that is often missing from our textbooks? A focus on the environment. Good, really good. That's exactly what the intent was of that film clip. So thank you, Mike. What I'm trying to show here through this film clip is that the Great Depression and the New Deal did not only involve economic and political changes, but environmental changes as well. And that's because Franklin Roosevelt was very, very aware of the role that nature was playing during the Great Depression and the role it was to play in the New Deal. So to fully understand why Franklin Roosevelt felt this way, we have to return to Franklin Roosevelt's youth up the Hudson River in Hyde Park, New York. So we're going to take a step back in time. We're going to examine Franklin Roosevelt's early life, figure out how he began to see the economic problem of the Great Depression as linked to an environmental crisis at the time. And then we'll move into the New Deal and then come back to Irvington. So Franklin Roosevelt's roots really began in his childhood. His roots with nature really began in his childhood up at Springwood, up at Hyde Park, New York, about an hour north of Irvington, also on the Hudson River. He was the son of a very wealthy merchant family. This is the home. It was called Springwood. It was a working farm located on the shores of the Hudson River. And as a young man, Franklin Roosevelt quickly became aware of environmental problems that were plaguing his estate. And this is the only time I'm going to read one paragraph from my book, just to give you an idea of Franklin Roosevelt's early life and how, as a young man, he began to become aware of the role that the environment was playing in his own family's economic fortunes. So I'll just read this one paragraph. Franklin Roosevelt first experienced the deterioration of natural resources while growing up on his family's estate in Hyde Park, New York. Located approximately halfway between New York City and Albany, the 1,200-acre parcel of land sloped steeply upward from the eastern bank of the Hudson River to a level bluff, on top of which sat the family home. Although the Roosevelt family acquired the property, which they called Springwood, in the early 19th century, Dutch settlers had worked much of the estate's land for more than 200 years. This became all too obvious to Roosevelt when in 1910, at the age of 28, he took over management of the property from his mother, Sarah. After learning from estate records that his ancestors had grown prize-winning corn at Springwood in 1840, Roosevelt became understandably concerned that 70 years later, the property produced only half of what it had in the mid-19th century. He also became alarmed at the large gullies that had formed and continued to widen along the property's steepest slopes, slopes that had been cleared decades before for cultivation. With every rain, the gullies washed fertile topsoil off the property down into the Hudson River. The rest of the estate suffered similarly. Yields of grain, pasturage, fruit, and vegetables were far below average because the rocky Hudson Valley soil had long since passed its peak. As Roosevelt put it, quote, "I can lime it, cross-plow it, manure it, and treat it to every art known to science, but it had just plain run out." So what Franklin Roosevelt's realizing is that he has a soil erosion problem on his estate, on his farm. And in response to this, what Franklin Roosevelt does is he becomes a tree planting freak. He plants between 20 and 50,000 trees a year on his estate up at Hyde Park. Here he is later in life when he was president with Forester Nelson Brown of Syracuse University. Brown helped him create a tree planting regimen for the property. And again, this was not tree planting for timber to sell wood. It was tree planting to hold the soil in place so it didn't run down those hills into the Hudson River. He was so enamored with tree planting that in the early 1920s, when he went to vote, he listed his occupation as tree farmer. Now, at first glance, we might think that Franklin Roosevelt was a bit strange in planting all these trees and being so concerned with soil erosion. But it turns out during the early 20th century, he was not alone. Many Americans were concerned with the wasteful ways of agriculture and industry, that they were inefficiently using our natural resources such as timber, soil, and water. And in response, these Americans joined together to promote what they called conservation, the conservation of natural resources. Use them efficiently so that we can continue to use them into the future. This was not about preserving wilderness or preserving land. It was about using it wisely so we could continue to use it. And it was very popular, this idea, and it became a movement called the Progressive Era Conservation Movement, and Franklin Roosevelt was part of that. Now, when he left his estate, Springwood, and moved up to Albany in 1912, when he became a New York senator, he took this interest in conservation with him to the state capitol. And also when he was elected governor in 1929, he kept it there with him as well. He was chair of the Senate's Forest, Fish, and Game Committee, and he also helped to further expand protection in the Adirondack Forest Preserve. In 1932, when he becomes president, he takes this interest in conservation with him from Albany to Washington, D.C. And when he becomes president, he creates several conservation programs that basically put conservation at the center of the economic recovery, but also the center of his New Deal. And I want to just go over a couple of these conservation programs quickly. The Soil Conservation Service. This is a photograph of a farm in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. Can anyone let me know in the chat what we're looking at? This sort of bullseye type thing in the middle of this farm field? Anyone know what that is? Contour plowing, really good. So what the Soil Conservation Service did was it helped farmers to reorganize their farmscapes. So this is a field with a hill. in the middle of it. Before the Soil Conservation Service, that farmer used to plow those fields straight up the hill and straight down the other side. And when it rained, that rain would flow down the hill through the crop rows and take that topsoil with it. So the Soil Conservation Service taught farmers to contour plow their fields perpendicular to the slope, so it would hold that water and soil on the fields for longer. Franklin Roosevelt also created the Tennessee Valley Authority. This was done for the generation of electricity, but also to help with irrigation for farming. This is the Norris Dam, which was constructed between 1933 and 1936. You can see that electric infrastructure over on the right-hand side of that picture. And then, of course, the Civilian Conservation Corps, which was really the most famous New Deal conservation program around. This is actually a linoleum cut done by an artist from the Federal Artists Project, documenting the CCC, and that's the image I use for the cover of my book. But let's dive into the CCC a bit more and really understand what the Civilian Conservation Corps did. To do that, we should listen to Franklin Roosevelt, because he announced the CCC to the American people in a May 7th, 1933 fireside chat, where he defends his creation of the Corps very, very specifically. So it's hard to hear. It's great to hear because we don't often get to hear Franklin Roosevelt's voice, but it's difficult to hear, so do your best. It's only about 30 seconds long. And while you're listening, I want you to think about how Roosevelt is defending the Corps. How is he framing it with the American people? Okay.
First, we are giving opportunity of employment to 250,000 of the unemployed, especially the young men who have dependents. Let them go into forestry and flood prevention work. That is a big task because it means feeding and clothing and caring for nearly twice as many men as we have in the regular army itself. And in creating this Civilian Conservation Corps, we are killing two birds with one stone. We are clearly enhancing the value of our natural resources, and at the same time, we are relieving an appreciable amount of actual distress. This great group of men, young men, have entered upon their work on a purely voluntary basis. No military training is involved, and we are conserving not only our natural resources, but also our human resources. One of the great values to this work is the fact that it is direct and requires the intervention of very little machinery.
Okay, so he announces this, and how is he defending it? How is he trying to gain popular support for this? Just type away in the chat. I'm really happy that the chat seems to be working a little bit, so that's great. We have to remember also that he's rolling this out within his first 100 days in office. It's incredibly fast. If you can just imagine a federal program being created and then 6 weeks later, it's actually functioning. Any ideas here? Economic benefits with the environmental benefits. Perfect. That's exactly right. He doesn't see the Great Depression as just an economic crisis. He sees it as an environmental crisis as well. The CCC was volunteer. Yep, absolutely. And we're going to learn more about those volunteers in a second. But the phrase that Roosevelt uses is killing two birds with one stone, right? Providing jobs as well as protecting the environment. That's exactly right. So he's arguing that it solves both crises, the economic crises and the environmental crisis. So let's look at the people who are helping him do this, the enrollees themselves. Here they are, some of the young men lining up to join. Between 1933 and 1942, the years of the Corps, 3.5 million young men enrolled in the CCC. The requirements were you had to be unemployed. Between the ages of 18 and 25, you had to be unmarried, and your families had to be on relief rolls. So your parents were usually unemployed. And these young men were called enrollees when they signed up. They were paid $1 a day, or $30 a month. Of that $30 monthly pay, $25 was sent home to their families to help their families get through the Great Depression. That comes to about $500 today going home. So if a family had, for instance, 2 sons in the CCC, it was $1,000 in today's money a month. $5 of that monthly wage, these young men kept in their pockets. And we're going to return to that $5 a little bit later. That would equate to about $100 today per month. Where did they work? Well, they went from enrolling into camps, 200-man camps. Each camp had 200 men in it. These are some images from Camp Connor in Chenipsett State Forest. The upper image, we see the campgrounds in the middle. We see some barracks. In the lower image, you see a bird's eye view that has the 4 barracks up top and then the 2 mess halls down in the middle. There's also an infirmary, library, and recreation hall. And if you look in the upper part of this picture, you'll see a baseball field as well, right up in the top middle of that lower picture. They were scattered all over the country. At any one moment, there were 1,400 of these camps, each with 200 men in them, all over the country. These dots are places where these camps were in 1933, and they were continually moving around to tackle different types of conservation work and conservation problems. Now, I just want to explain Franklin Roosevelt's involvement in this program. He was very, very involved, and he knew that these camps, as we're going to discuss in a few minutes, were an economic boon for the local communities nearby, and I'll explain why in a minute. But Franklin Roosevelt used these camps as political tools. He would assign them to districts with politicians who supported the New Deal. And sometimes if there were politicians who did not support the New Deal, he would withdraw camps from those locations as a carrot and stick type of method to keep support for the New Deal rolling along in the 1930s. So what kind of work did they do? It's most known for planting trees, and that's really what the CCC started out doing, planting trees. It planted 2.3 billion trees, that's billion with a B, between 1933 and 1942. That's 12 trees for every Depression-era American, and 1/2 of the trees planted in US history up to that time. Here we see an enrollee in South Carolina planting a seedling. But in 1934, the Corps shifted its work. Anyone have an idea why? What happened in 1934 that might have made Franklin Roosevelt and the CCC rethink their work and expand it to cover another type of conservation work? The Dust Bowl. Dust storms, there we go. Dust storms in 1934. This is a South Dakota farm in 1936, inundated by that dust. And this raises concerns all over the country over soil erosion. And it's at this point that the CCC expands its work from planting trees to also conserving soil. And it does this on millions and millions of acres of farmland all across the United States. Here we see a CCC enrollee helping a farmer in Vernon County, Wisconsin, contour plow or terrace his field. But then in the late 1930s, the Corps' work shifts again and expands once more to include recreational development work. And it was very, very extensive. The Corps built from the ground up 800 new state parks, developed dozens of national parks, improved municipal parks, and here we see a picnic shelter in Minnesota. If any of you have walked in a state park, you're probably walking on trails built by the CCC. And if you've been to a visitor center or a comfort station in a national park, you've probably also been inside a CCC structure. So again, this is the work that was put forward as potentially solving these two crises, an economic crisis on the one hand and an environmental crisis on the other. So now I want to switch gears a little bit. I want to transition from this national story to a more local story about the CCC in the Hudson Valley. And I want to look at Bear Mountain State Park in particular before returning to Irvington. And in doing that, I want to assess how well the CCC did in trying to solve these two crises, one economic and one environmental. And I'm wondering how much time I have. Good. Okay, so story number 2, the CCC in the Hudson Valley. This is Bear Mountain State Park. Here it is with the Hudson River flowing south to New York City. We see it here on the map. And the first camp entered Bear Mountain State Park on May 18th, 1933. Again, 6 weeks after the CCC was created, the program had begun and people enrollees were going into the forests and the parks of the country to begin their work. Here's a picture of those enrollees hiking into the first camp in Bear Mountain. By the end of 1934, there were 11 camps in Bear Mountain State Park with 200 men each in them. That's more camps than most national parks had. And the reason that Bear Mountain was rewarded was because, number one, Franklin Roosevelt had a real soft spot in his heart for Bear Mountain. He had been very involved with the Boy Scouts of America in Bear Mountain. But also Bear Mountain was very close to New York City. And the idea was if they could develop Bear Mountain for recreation, it could help a lot of those people, those working class people in New York who could get up the Hudson pretty easily and enjoy that recreation. So the enrollees arrive, 11 camps with 200 enrollees each. That means over 2,000 young men were pouring into Bear Mountain State Park and creating these camps in the park by 1934. Now, just an aside, there was also a female CCC camp in Bear Mountain. It was the only female CCC camp in the nation. It was called Camp Terra. Here we see Eleanor Roosevelt in the middle addressing the enrollees from that camp. Eleanor had lobbied Franklin hard for years to create and to allow women to join the CCC. He didn't, and we can talk about the reasons why in the Q&A, but she was able to create one camp, Camp Terra in Bear Mountain, and these women were not taught conservation skills, but instead were taught domestic skills like cooking, cleaning, and childcare that they could then bring home to their families. And I really think it would be great in the Q&A to talk about sort of the gendered division here, not just with the CCC, but also with many, many New Deal programs, and also the fact that the CCC was segregated. African Americans, for the most part, had their own camps as well. So there was a lot of inequality going on during this period that it would be good to discuss in its historical context later in the Q&A. So how successful was the CCC at solving, on the one hand, the economic crisis in the Hudson Valley, but also that environmental crisis in the region as well? So let's turn first to the economic emergency. Oops, sorry. The Hudson Valley's economic crisis was severe during the early years of the Great Depression. Because of a decrease in New York City's economy, upriver trade and the upriver economy also began to shrink. And because of that, the Hudson Valley actually had a higher unemployment rate than the national average, which at that point was 25%. This is what the manager of Bear Mountain said in 1930. The unemployment situation in the vicinity of the park is most deplorable. A number of the large factories have closed up and discharged all of their employees. It is hard to overemphasize the suffering that is bound to come before spring. So again, the crisis was worse in the Hudson Valley than it was in many places in the country. So how did the CCC solve this problem? To understand that, we have to look at the economic history of the Civilian Conservation Corps. And we have to remember that those enrollees got to keep that $5, put it in their pocket every month. And what they did with that $5 was each week, twice a week, those enrollees got into the trucks that were in their camps and drove to nearby towns, where they went to movie halls, they went to restaurants, they went to beer halls and spent that money. They went to dances as well. So if we think about it, we have 2,200 enrollees with $5 in their pockets every single month. That means over $10,000 per month is going into those local communities. Some of these businesses gained quite a bit, and I'll discuss this laundry business in a second here. The second aspect of this economic history is that each camp also purchased goods and services from local communities around the Bear Mountain region. On average, each camp purchased $5,000 per month on food, supplies, and services in nearby towns. And as the owner of the Haverstraw Laundry said, my business grew with the coming of the CCC camps to our vicinity. So if we do the math here, if there were 11 camps in Bear Mountain, each one spending about $5,000 in the local economy, which means $55,000 per month or over $650,000 per year in 1930 dollars were flowing into the local economy. And again, these are the towns that were surrounding Bear Mountain. Tuxedo Park, Sloatsburg, Suffern, Ramapo, all of these towns benefited from this economic relationship with the CCC camps. Business Week in 1935 proclaimed, quote, hundreds of communities have discovered since the CCC was organized 2 years ago that the neighboring camp is the bright spot on their business map. Okay, so far pretty good record with economics. How about the environmental crisis in the Hudson Valley? Prior to the Great Depression, the Hudson Valley had been heavily logged, and this was to fuel the Industrial Revolution, which began in New York City and then moved up the Hudson. This logging was needed to fuel the factories, the homes, the steamboats and railroads that created the industrial region around New York. And because of this, the area in the Hudson Highlands and up and down the Hudson was heavily logged during this period. This is a very early logging group around 1900, and it just continued into the 1930s. So how did the Corps solve this problem in Bear Mountain? Well, very early on, the CCC began planting trees in areas of the park that had been severely logged over prior to its creation in the early 1900s. These are not images from Bear Mountain, but the CCC had seedling nurseries all over the country where they planted seeds and grew them into seedlings. Then they transferred those seedlings to the camps where they then had enrollees planting them in areas that had been deforested. Corps enrollees also protected Bear Mountain from forest fires. On the left, we see Perkins Memorial Tower, which the CCC built and then manned and watched over the park, searching for outbreaks of fire. And if a fire did arrive and begin, the young enrollees went out and actually suppressed the fires manually by themselves. In the mid-30s, the work at Bear Mountain shifted, just like it shifted throughout the rest of the country because of the Dust Bowl. And the enrollees in Bear Mountain began to plant trees, not just in areas that had been deforested, but also they began to plant trees in areas that were suffering from soil erosion. And here we see some CCC enrollees on a very, very steep slope here. And then to just hark back to the conservation movement that Franklin Roosevelt was so involved in, this reforestation work and the soil work were not new. They were very much in line with progressive era conservation. The notion that we needed to conserve and use wisely our natural resources like timber and soil. So again, not that new, but in the late 30s, when the Corps begins to expand its work again into the recreational area, that's where we see something quite novel. So the CCC did extensive recreation work in Bear Mountain. It improved the park transportation network. It built brand new hiking trails. This is a trail up Bear Mountain to Perkins Memorial Tower. It blazed new trails throughout the park, and it constructed hiking shelters. It built automobile roads. Here we see on the left, enrollees blasting Perkins Memorial Drive into the side of the mountain. And here on the right, we see Perkins Memorial Drive today. It developed comfort stations and cafeterias and hiking shelters also throughout the park. And the CCC in Bear Mountain also built small dams. Any ideas why they might be building a dam in a state park? There's a great question here. What consideration was given to ensure fair employment of Blacks and Native people who could not join unions? We can discuss that in the Q&A. But Native Americans had their own CCC on Indian reservations. It was quite separate, as were African Americans in their own separate camps. But any ideas why they might build dams in places like Bear Mountain State Park? It wasn't to conserve water and generate electricity, but rather to increase, yes, dams for swimming, exactly right. All told, the CCC created 10 new bodies of water at Bear Mountain, expanding the park's water surface area by 1,000 acres. Lake Sebago, Lake Welch, Lake Tiarati, huge swimming areas, many of them created for working class people from New York City who didn't have access to these sorts of spaces. As the Palisades Interstate Park Commission wrote in 1934, the hard work of CCC laborers on dam projects was transforming meadows and wooded swamps and beaver ponds into clear, shining lakes. Now, this recreation work was not part of that conservation movement in the early part of the century that Franklin Roosevelt was involved in. Again, that was concerned with natural resources. Rather, this recreational work, the CCC claimed, was linked to a concern for human resources, human health through outdoor recreation. Here we see that in a pamphlet that the CCC created on its recreational work. It writes, by undertaking park and forest developments for recreational purposes, the Corps is making a vitally important contribution to the conservation of the human wealth of the United States. And Franklin Roosevelt very much agreed. If we remember that fireside chat, his words were quite clear. In creating the Civilian Conservation Corps, we are killing two birds with one stone. We are conserving not only our natural resources, but our human resources as well. Now, in the book, I make the argument that it's that concern for human resources, human health, through the work these young men are doing in nature, building up their muscles, getting good food in these camps, but also human resources that are being conserved through outdoor recreation, creating these recreational landscapes in places like Bear Mountain, where working people from cities can come and be healthier. That, I argue, is what foreshadows the environmental movement of the 1960s. And in the Q&A, we can go into a little bit more about that transition from a 1930s idea of conservation to a 1960s notion of environmentalism. But right now I want to return and try to bring this back closer to home, to Irvington. How am I doing on time here? Let me see, we're good, okay, this will go quick. So I had been aware that there was a camp nearby in Elmsford, and that I thought to myself when I would go running back up in the woods beyond the Pete Oley woods, I saw some evidence up there of stonework that I thought might be CCC work. But I hadn't known the extent of this work done in our area. So I went on and did some research and found a brief film clip that notes the camp in Elmsford. And I just want to play it right now, and then I'll discuss some of the structures that we have here in Irvington.
At Elmsford, New York, and in 1,400 other communities of the land, buildings for new civilian conservation corps camps are going up. In many a town, the coming of CCC camps causes public debate.
So I cut this short because it goes on and it portrays the locals as being very upset that the CCC boys have moved into Elmsford. But as the work begins and continues, these community members come around, especially when they realize that a lot of the money is flowing from the federal government through the camp into their local community. There was one camp in Elmsford. It was Camp P109. The P stands for Park. It began its work in October of 1935. And it was basically doing infrastructure work in the region. And I want to talk about two projects that they did. One is structural work, and one is more extensive. But I'm sure many of you, I'm sure many of you are familiar with this structure. Technically not in Irvington, right over the Irvington line in neighboring Dobbs Ferry. This is the mile marker 26, which in the middle of this structure. This is the mile marker that Benjamin Franklin installed all over the colonies between 1763 and 1769. These were mile markers on post roads. This one emanating from New York City and going up the Albany Post Road, which is today Broadway. And obviously the CCC did not work on that, but the CCC did protect the mile marker with the stone protective structure around it. And at first, when I began looking at the CCC in the region, I thought that this might be the only structure in the area that the camp in Elmsford worked on. But then I realized we had not only a structure nearby, but an entire recreational landscape right in our backyard that many of us were never even aware of. And I certainly wasn't aware of its extent until very, very recently. So I'm going to take you on a brief tour of this landscape. It begins at the entrance to the Pete Oley Woods. And the area that I'm talking about specifically is over the ridge and down towards the Sawmill Parkway, which is where Macy Park lies. And the area I'm talking about is the portion of Macy Park that is west of the Sawmill, so between Cyrus Field Road and the Sawmill Parkway, which is now connected to the Pete Oley Woods. So if you go up into the Pete Oley Woods and you go towards what is now Legend Hollow, the development up on the top of Cyrus Field Road, if you cut down from what on this map says Irvington Manor Drive, and I'm going to take you on a tour from there going north towards Mountain Road and the very entrance to the Sawmill from Mountain Road. So there's a whole infrastructure back there that I was unaware of until very, very recently. So there's over a mile of hiking trails throughout this area. They mostly run along the lower part of the valley there, along the Sawmill River Parkway, but sometimes they also climb up to overlooks, which we're going to see in these woods. This is a picture of one of the hiking trails back in the 1930s that the CCC had worked on. And again, it's the camp from Elmsford and the enrollees from Elmsford that would come down and work on it. I should say in 1930, the Sawmill River Parkway only had reached Elmsford. It was still being built and had not reached farther north yet. So they were developing the parks along the parkway. The idea for parkways was to have parks along them that people could enjoy. And this was one of the trails. Here's a trail today. You can see the steps are still there. They're in pretty good shape. So they've lasted the time. Retaining walls all throughout this region. Here is a retaining wall not in our area of the park. This is much farther north near Eastview, north of Elmsford. This is a retaining wall and culverts. What's amazing about this is the extensive logging that had been done in this area and how barren the area is. And here are some retaining walls in our portion of Macy Park. On the top of that wall is one of the trails, one of the paths that you can walk on today. Along this trail that you just saw, I found at least 4 stone benches that have been built into the sides of these trails. They're absolutely beautiful and mostly covered up. And this would be beginning in the southern area near Ardsley and then moving farther and farther towards the Mountain Road entrance to the sawmill. Here's a second one. Again, people would come, park their cars. There was a parking lot down on the sawmill where people could park their cars and then come up and walk and rest on these benches. Another one there. The last one on the right, you can see that hole on the right side. I believe this bench used to have a thick piece of wood as the bench that went across it rather than just all stone. Overlooks. This was an overlook that was built in the 1930s by the CCC. This is not in our portion of the park, but you can see how these overlooks worked. The idea was to allow people to see down into the Sawmill Valley when there wasn't a lot of overgrowth. And we have one of these overlooks in Irvington as well. This is the view from the top, completely overgrown, so you can't see very much, but it's a nice, beautiful spot nevertheless. And this is the Macy Memorial. Some people probably are aware of the Macy Memorial. It was created early on when the park was just being dedicated. This is what it looked like in the 1930s after the CCC had worked on it. And here's what it looks like today. It's very, very far down towards the sawmill. Right below this, about 50 feet below it, there was again that parking lot. People could walk up to this memorial for Macy, the man who they dedicated the park to. V. Everett Macy, they have a plaque there for him. And then this is Mountain Road. This is at the very end where you come out on Mountain Road. And this is included not because the CCC did any work on it, but because I had to then run up Mountain Road to get home after taking all those pictures. So I thought I had to include it there. So let's just end this by returning to Wilbur. Think a little bit more deeply about Wilbur. I'm going to open up the chat again. Where is Dobbs Ferry? Can you go back to the previous slide? So, so 2 questions here. What, Ruth Cowan asks, what was it about the CCC that troubled the Elmsford residents? Most of what troubled people when the CCC moved in was they thought of these young men as coming from cities, and they thought of them as immigrants. So they were very concerned that these young city slickers were going to come up and cause problems and drink and cavort with their daughters, basically, is what I heard over and over again. But it turned out that the CCC enrollees were 50% of them were from cities, but also 50% of them were from rural areas. So it was really an unfounded worry. Dobbs Ferry, I think the person's referring to the mile marker. So it's right at the entrance to Mercy College. If you look at the entrance to Mercy College, to the right of that entrance, up towards Irvington, about 100 feet, you'll see that stone marker there with the CCC stone around it. We also have a second Franklin marker in Irvington. It is between Station Road and Main Street, going up the hill from Harriman. On the left, if you look very closely, in that big stone wall, there is a mile marker in there as well, right where those new houses are going up, where the Education Foundation building used to be. Anyway, let's talk about Wilbur. if we can write in the chat any new ideas about Wilbur and what this cartoon means. I'll let you know this was a cartoon drawn by CCC enrollees. They all had camp newspapers in their camps, and they had artists who would draw cartoons in those camp newspapers about their experiences. So this is one of them. So we see Wilbur in the first image. He's scrawny and small. He's wearing sort of young boy clothes. He has a hurt foot with no shoes. And then he comes back a year later. He's dressed in a CCC uniform with a tie. If you noticed on his luggage, he has some stickers. He might have been traveling a lot. A lot of these young men went far out west to camps out west. And his mother and father barely recognize him. He's changed so much. And that's part of the human conservation that Franklin Roosevelt. He's stronger and healthier and more confident as well. I think that's a really important aspect. In the upper picture, he's very, very shy. In the bottom picture, he's confident. He strides into the room, self-assured. And that transformation is really what Franklin Roosevelt was talking about when he mentioned the conservation of human resources. In this case, young Wilbur was being transformed through the work he was doing, building those hiking trails in places like Irvington, building those benches, building those stone walls. But we have to remember that other folks like us today can go and recreate on that landscape and also build up ourselves health-wise, conserve our own human resources. And that's exactly what Franklin Roosevelt was alluding to in his fireside chat. So that's all I have for now. I'd love to talk in Q&A more about both this history, but also perhaps about some of the looming issues we have now and the possibility of a Green New Deal and also a new CCC. Maria Harris has a question. Who provided Wilbur the shoes, clothes, since only $1 a day? The young enrollees, when they went to camp, were given uniforms, 2 sets of uniforms. In the beginning, they were military uniforms. Then later, they had their own CCC uniforms delivered to all the camps. So they were given clothing, they were given shelter in these barracks, and they were given a lot of food that they ate 3 times a day. And on average, they gained between 15 and 20 pounds after 6 months in the CCC, which the Corps promoted relentlessly to show that these young men were getting stronger and healthier when they were working out in American nature. Who ran the camps? There was, when Franklin Roosevelt created the Corps, there was some concern that if the military ran the whole CCC, which was the plan originally, that it could militarize America's youth. And this is what people were afraid of because it was happening in Germany at the time. There was a group called, it was a Green Corps, and the young men in Germany were under the military's control doing similar work like planting trees. And there was a concern that if that happened in the US, it could lead to similar situation. So Franklin Roosevelt tailored it back. The military only ran the camps. So when the young men were in the camps, they were under military administration. And then when they left every day to go to work, they worked for the Department of Interior or the Department of Agriculture, depending on their job. Oh, my friend Caitlin Lynch is out there. That's awesome. What do we know about what happened to these men after the CCC ended? 90% of them went into the US military. So all that concern about not militarizing the youth might have been for naught, because many of these young men became accustomed to living in barracks, to eating in mess halls, and they made a very easy transition from the CCC into the military. We have to remember most of these young men were working class youths who hadn't gone to college, so the military was a very good avenue for them. So that's what happened to most of them. A lot of them also went into conservation jobs. They worked for the Forest Service. They became agronomists and worked for the Soil Conservation Service as well. Many Americans regarded the New Deal as socialism. Did they criticize the CCC in those terms? Yes, there was a lot of concern in the beginning that socialists and communists would infiltrate the CCC camps and try to convert these young men. And the Corps went out of its way to dispel this notion. As a matter of fact, the Elmsford film clip that you saw later on in that film clip, they mention this. They talk about dissidents and sort of troublemakers within that camp and how they were going to get rid of them. So the CCC had a very extensive publicity arm that really tried to dispel this notion that socialists and communists could infiltrate the CCC. Another aspect of that is that the CCC was very conscious and promoted the notion that these young men, when they came in, they might have come in as Irish Americans, Polish Americans, Italian Americans, but the CCC argued that when they left as American men. So they came in as boys and left as men. And in that process, in that transition, there was an Americanization going on, they claimed, the CCC claimed, for these young men. So it was a very much of a nationalistic sort of organization at the time. How did they set up the camp so quickly? At first, they used tents that they lived in and got the tents up and running, got the young men in there very, very quickly, got the tents, and then had the men build the barracks. And then they transitioned to prefabricated barracks, and they moved them around just very, very quickly, and they just threw money at the problem. They just printed money and got the camps moving. What else here? Did they grow their own food? Nope. They bought all the food locally, and local grocers very much benefited from that. Okay. Does the Green New Deal have any plans for a CCC type initiative? The Green New Deal doesn't mention the CCC specifically, but it's very much based on the CCC as sort of a stand-in for conservation efforts during the New Deal period. The one interesting aspect is that the Green New Deal and also the new CCC program that's been put forth by Dick Durbin from Illinois, they all sort of include the notion of social and environmental justice, which is very important because the original CCC was in many ways very unjust. It was only young men who could join. Obviously, women were not able to. As I said, African Americans were segregated in the Corps. They often could not administer CCC camps. So in other words, African Americans could be in their own CCC camp and be administered by white leaders in the camp. Native Americans were in their own CCC, and it was on Indian reservations, and they did not go to the camp. They lived at home and would travel to their work site and then go back home. Additionally, the CCC did most of its work out in forests and parks. It did not do any work really in communities that might need this work. So for instance, if a community had a pollution problem in their midst, the CCC would not go into that community to work on those problems. So there was an environmental justice aspect that was lacking from the original CCC. And the new programs really emphasized that that would have to be corrected for a new program to take root today. Were the projects that each camp did dictated by local interests, or were they determined by the national administration? It was a combination of both. Franklin Roosevelt definitely had certain ideas about what needed to be done on a national scale, but locals were very involved in the CCC camps. They visited the camps wanted those locals involved. They wanted to get the support of local people, and often the local community would have a project that they wanted, and the CCC would take it on. So it was very much a combination of the two. But again, it wasn't the sort of situation where if a local community had a pollution problem that the CCC would tackle that. It was more we need some trees planted over here. We need soil, conserved over there. Let's see. How do you account for the resistance to the idea of a Green New Deal? It worked before. I think that part of the resistance is that it would cost a lot, which I understand. But I think what the original CCC illustrates is that money flows from the federal government and flows back into local communities and back into local people's pockets. So I think that, if people understood the economic history of the New Deal, they might feel differently about that. The other issue is this notion of climate change, and I think that has to be central to any Green New Deal and also any new and improved CCC. And right now, the political climate is questioning the validity of climate change, which is 97% of all scientists, climate scientists, agree that it is human induced, but that could be another reason for a hesitancy. But if you look at Joe Biden's new proposal, he very much incorporates infrastructure development. He very much highlights union workers in any sort of Green New Deal. And he also lists climate change and social justice as part of a program as well. So his Green New Deal seems to be taking into account some of the mistakes from the original New Deal and trying to correct them for a new and improved version of that. Let's see. In mentioning how 90% of CCC enrollees entered the US military, has there been any research that you're aware of on how the CCC contributed to the success of the US military in World War II? No, all I know is that many of the young men in the CCC moved up the ranks in the military quite quickly because they had already been accustomed to sort of military life in the CCC camps. That's all I know about that aspect of it. I will say that the young enrollees, I've done some oral interviews with them, and many of them are really, really, the memory of the CCC lasts with them and is very, very important to them. Many of them think of that time almost as their college experience, the first time they were away from their family, the first time they were in a community of peers, the first time they were really, really on their own, and they look back on it with incredible nostalgia, actually. There's a great need for the CCC to remedy the outcomes of the Western fires that are happening now to deal with soil erosion affecting Western watersheds and causing landslides. And I agree 100%. Another issue we have to think about is that how the CCC could focus in a pandemic and during the COVID pandemic. In some ways, the CCC is set up very well for that. These camps were pretty much isolated. They were 200-man camps set off in parks and forests. But as I said, they did have a lot of interaction between the camps and the towns. So that would have to be eliminated. And unfortunately, there is evidence that some of the firefighting camps out in the West, where the firefighters are in their camps, there is some evidence that those camps are actually spreading the coronavirus throughout the region. So there have been some concerns about setting up camps like this in areas that are close to other communities. But I really think that could be dealt with, in a way that isolated the CCC camps from those local communities. So I think it could be a very good moment to create a CCC.
Do we have a couple more questions, either in the chat or if somebody wants to raise their hand and ask their question by turning their mic off, either way. But why don't we do a couple more questions, Neil, and then we can finish up. For those of you who would like to ask a question orally, the way to do it is you go down to the bottom of your screen, click on participants, and over on the right-hand side, you'll see raise your hand. And that will allow people to, Neil, then be able, I see a hand just went up for Ann White. And if you can unmute her, Neil, and
Yep. How
how to do that?
I just unmuted myself.
Okay,
Great.
fine.
Yeah, I just wanted to point to, I mentioned a film, Symphony of the Soils, that's available on the Writer Center, the Hudson Valley Writer Center website, for viewing for free through the end of the month. And it's a very beautiful film. It includes a piece on the stone barns and pieces on soil all around the world.
Great. So much nicer when other people can talk and I'm not just talking into the computer.
Right.
Thank you. Here's one. Okay.
Well, maybe we've kind of finished our questions. What I would encourage everybody to reach out to Neil directly if you have other questions. And I'm going to turn over to Veronica in a second, but I just really wanted to say, Neil, thanks so much. It's just totally fascinating. And I really like the fact that you've highlighted in our own backyard how this improved what's today the Irvington Woods for us. It's really, really great. So Veronica, let me turn it over to you to kind of close out this session.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, Neil, that was fabulous. Neil asked me to mention to everyone that my dad was a lucky participant in the CCC. He was recruited off the streets of Brooklyn, not knowing where his next meal was coming from, and sent to Montana to plant white pine trees. And he was grateful for the experience for the rest of his life. So and Neil's talk is personally very personal for me. But to end today, I just want to remind you all to go to our IrvingtonHistoricalSociety.org website. If you haven't signed up, please register for our October 18th event. And have a nice rest of your day.